He threw her homemade lunch into the kitchen trash right in front of everyone. A silent act of dominance, but his 4-year-old daughter saw it all. And when the maid sat alone on the cold marble floor with her replacement sandwich, the little girl did something that would shatter her father's world. She climbed down, sat beside her, and silently offered to share. This was the Reed family penthouse, where the maid Maria had served for 3 years. For millionaire Thomas Reed, it was about control. For his 4-year-old daughter Lily, it was about something simpler, right and wrong. And in the quiet aftermath of that humiliating moment, a single question would begin to unravel everything. What secret was Maria carrying that made her endure such treatment? And why would a child's silent protest expose it? Thomas Reed didn't see a person when he looked at Maria. He saw a transaction, a service he'd purchased. His fortune, built on ruthless commercial real estate deals, had trained him to view everything through a lens of cost and control. His penthouse was a trophy, and Maria, the 28-year-old from a small coastal town, was part of the display. Neat, quiet, and invisible. That was the agreement. But Maria saw everything. She saw the empty bottles of single malt scotch hidden in the study cabinet after his late nights. She saw the unopened birthday cards from his sister, discarded in the shredder. She saw the way he'd stare at his daughter Lily's drawings with a confusion that bordered on pain, as if he couldn't comprehend their simple joy. Maria cleaned around this sadness, saying nothing. Her own life was a carefully balanced act of survival. Every month, 70% of her salary was wired directly to a clinic in her hometown. Her 6-year-old son, Matteo, was there, fighting a rare immune deficiency. The treatment was experimental, devastatingly expensive, and not covered by any insurance she could afford. The Reed family salary was his lifeline. This was the unspoken contract, her dignity for his breath. The lunch incident wasn't the first act of humiliation, just the most public. The week before, Thomas had criticized the way she folded his newspapers, claiming the crease was off by a millimeter. He'd made her refold an entire week's worth while he watched. Another time, he deducted $50 from her pay because a single water spot was found on a wine glass. Maria took it all in silence, mentally converting each insult into hours of medication for Matteo. Lily, however, was a different story. The 4-year-old was a silent observer in her own home. While her father was on conference calls, Lily would follow Maria around, not to bother her, but to be near her. She'd hand Maria the polish for the silver, or sit quietly on a stool drawing pictures that always included 3 figures, a big stick man, a small girl, and a woman in the middle holding their hands. She never gave these to her father. The day of the throne lunch started like any other. Maria had prepared her usual meal, a chicken sandwich on homemade bread, a small container of rice and beans, and an apple. She ate in the kitchen at 12:30, always exactly 30 minutes. Thomas was working from home that day, which meant the atmosphere was tense. He was preparing for a major investor call, one that could secure a $20 million partnership. Lily was having a lunch of her own at the kitchen island, organic pasta shapes and steamed vegetables prepared by the family's personal chef who left by 11. Thomas entered the kitchen to get more ice for his water. He saw Maria's lunch bag on the counter, a faded floral fabric beside his stainless steel appliances. It offended his aesthetic. Without a word, he picked it up, walked to the integrated trash bin, and let it drop. The soft thud of the sandwich hitting the empty bag was the only sound. Maria froze, a fork halfway to her mouth. Her cheeks burned. The 2 junior associates from Thomas's firm, who were in the kitchen grabbing sparkling water, exchanged a glance and quickly looked away. Thomas smoothed his suit jacket. "We don't keep clutter on the counter, Maria. This isn't a diner." He said it calmly, as if stating a simple fact. Then he turned to leave, as if the matter was closed. But it wasn't closed for Lily. She had watched the entire scene from her high chair, her big blue eyes wide. She looked at Maria's face, then at the trash bin, then back at her father's, retreating back. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply pushed her bowl of pasta away, the spoon clattering against the marble. An hour later, after the associates had left and Thomas was back in his office, Maria sat on the floor in the pantry, a small safe space out of sight. She was assembling a new sandwich from scraps, some leftover bread ends, a piece of cheese. Her hands were shaking. The first tears fell, not just from today's shame, but from the accumulated weight of 100 such moments, and from the terrifying thought of losing this job. She didn't hear the soft footsteps. Lily appeared in the pantry doorway, clutching her own discarded lunch bowl. She looked at Maria, then at the sad new sandwich on a paper towel. Without a word, Lily set her bowl down, sat cross-legged on the floor right next to Maria, and pointed to the sandwich. Then she looked up at Maria and offered a tiny, solemn smile. This was the scene Thomas walked in on. He'd come to the kitchen for coffee and stopped cold. His daughter, in her $300 dress, sitting on the floor beside the maid, both of them silently sharing a makeshift meal. Lily looked up at him, her expression not angry, but deeply disappointed. It was a look that bypassed his ego and went straight to something he'd buried long ago, his own conscience. He didn't yell, he just stood there, his grip tightening on his coffee mug. The image of his daughter choosing solidarity with the help over the comfort of her privilege was a silent indictment he couldn't process. He turned and walked out, his mind racing with a turmoil he hadn't felt in years. That night Thomas couldn't sleep. The look on Lily's face haunted him. He paced his study, and for the first time his eyes fell not on his deal trophies, but on a forgotten family photo. It was of him as a boy, standing beside his own mother, who worked as a cleaner in an office building. He remembered the shame he felt when a classmate saw her emptying trash. He remembered vowing never to be looked down upon like that. The memory hit him with a sickening clarity. He had become the very thing he'd feared. Driven by a guilt he couldn't name, he did something impulsive. He accessed the household employment files. He never looked at Maria's full contract or her emergency contact details before. He skimmed past her address, her ID number, and then his eyes caught on the listed beneficiary for a small life insurance policy the agency required. It was a name, Mateo Flores. Relationship, son. A son. Maria had a son. The realization was a shock. Why did she never mention him? Why wasn't he here with her? A cold suspicion began to form. He opened a new tab on his computer and, with the skills of a man used to due diligence, began a shallow search. He typed in the name of the clinic listed as her emergency contact. What he found was a single, stark line on a medical fundraising page that hadn't been updated in months. It was for a child named Mateo, seeking funds for a last-chance treatment. The page was created by Maria Flores. The funding progress bar was stuck at 15%. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the blue light of the screen washing over his face. The proud, controlling millionaire had just been schooled in basic humanity by his 4-year-old, and now he was faced with a truth he could no longer ignore. The quiet woman he'd humiliated for years wasn't just an employee. She was a mother, fighting a desperate, lonely battle, and he had been actively making it harder. The next morning, he found Maria cleaning the windows in the living room. He cleared his throat. She stiffened, not turning around, bracing for another correction. But his question, when it came, was quiet, stripped of all its usual authority. "Maria," he asked, "who is Mateo?" She froze, the cleaning cloth slipping from her fingers. Maria's face went ashen. She slowly turned, her eyes wide with a fear far deeper than any she'd shown over a thrown lunch. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the penthouse ventilation. "He is my son," she finally whispered, the words sounding like a surrender. Thomas gestured to the sofa. "Sit, please." It was the first time he'd used the word with her. Maria sat stiffly on the edge of a cushion, her hands knotted in her lap, and the story poured out, not in a flood, but in measured, painful drops. Mateo, 6 years old, diagnosed at 4 with a severe combined immunodeficiency. The local doctors had run out of options. An experimental gene therapy trial in the capital city was his only chance. The cost was $200,000 up front, a sum as abstract to her as the stars. "So you came here," Thomas stated, not asked. "I signed a 3-year contract with the agency," Maria said, her voice flat. "They advanced me a portion of the fee. The rest of my salary goes to them to pay it back. I see less than 20%. If I leave before the contract ends, I owe the full balance immediately. I cannot leave." Thomas felt a cold nausea. He'd used that agency, prestige domestic staffing, for years, recommended by peers for their discreet, trouble-free service. He'd never questioned their fees. He was now realizing his convenience was built on a form of indentured servitude. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question was out before he could stop it, and he immediately heard its staggering privilege. Maria looked directly at him, a spark of defiance cutting through her exhaustion. "And say what, Mr. Reed? That I needed a raise because my child is dying, you deducted pay for water spots." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. He had created an atmosphere where such a vulnerability would have been a liability, not a reason for compassion. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over a city he felt he owned, but now seemed alien. "The clinic," he said. "The funding page, it's stalled." "The therapy window is closing," Maria said, her composure cracking. "If we don't start next month, his system may be too weak. They will give our spot to another family." She didn't cry. She just stated it as the final, unchangeable fact of her life. Thomas didn't make a grand promise. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Give me the clinic's details, all of it." It wasn't a request. It was an order, but of a different kind. For the first time, the order was meant to help her. He spent the rest of the day behind closed doors, but not on his deals. He called his lawyer, David Chen. "I need you to pull every contract, every agreement, every communication we have with Prestige Domestic Staffing. I want to see the flow of money, exactly what I paid them, and exactly what they were obligated to pay the employee." David, ever professional, asked, "Is there a problem with Maria's performance?" "The problem," Thomas said, his voice low, "is with my performance as a human being. Just get me the paperwork." While he waited, he did something else. He researched the disease. He read about isolation bubbles, about lifetimes spent in sterile environments, about the brutal math of medical debt. The abstract concept of a sick child dissolved, replaced by the specific, terrifying reality of Mateo's life. The documents from David arrived by evening. Thomas spread them across his desk. The numbers told a damning story. He had been paying Prestige Domestic a monthly fee of $4,500 for Maria's full-time service. According to the payment records they provided him, Maria's gross salary was $2,800, but the addendum, the one he'd never scrutinized, detailed the salary advance repayment. Net to employee after all deductions, $470 a week. He was paying the agency over $18,000 a year for their placement service, on top of the salary. Maria, working 60-hour weeks, was taking home under $25,000 a year, most of which was immediately sent to the clinic. The agency was siphoning off the rest to pay down their advance, with an interest rate buried in fine print that would keep her in debt for a decade. This wasn't employment. It was a financial trap engineered to keep a vulnerable person in perpetual service. And Thomas, by unquestioningly writing the checks, had been the engine that powered it. A fresh, hotter anger ignited in him. This was no longer just about guilt over a lunch. This was about uncovering a system of exploitation happening right under his nose, in his own home. He thought of Lily, sitting on the floor. She hadn't just seen a mean act. She had instinctively rebelled against a whole invisible structure of injustice that her father was upholding. The next morning, Thomas went to the agency. Prestige Domestic Staffing operated out of a sleek, modern office in the financial district. The receptionist smiled with polished indifference. Thomas asked to see the agency's director, a woman named Elena Vance. Elena appeared, all sharp blazer and calculated warmth. "Mr. Reed, what a pleasure. Is there an issue with Maria? We can arrange a replacement immediately." "I don't want a replacement," Thomas said, cutting through the pleasantries. "I want Maria Flores's complete contract file, and I want the amortization schedule for her salary advance." Elena's smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the corners. "I'm afraid those are confidential internal documents, Mr. Reed. Our arrangements with our domestic professionals are proprietary. We ensure they are fairly treated, of course. $470 a week for live-in work in this city is fair treatment." Thomas's voice was calm, which made it more dangerous. Elena's demeanor shifted from accommodating to defensive. The advance was a significant benefit. She consented to the repayment terms. "She's an adult. We're not a charity." "No," Thomas agreed softly. "You're a toll bridge, and I've been paying you to stand between a woman and her child's survival." He placed a copy of his payment records on her desk. his own highlighted in yellow. I've paid you over $200,000 across 3 years for Maria's services. Where did it go? Because only a fraction reached her. He then placed the clinic's information next to it. This is where the rest of her money needs to go. Now. Elena Vance looked at the papers, then back at Thomas. The professional mask slipped, revealing something colder. Mr. Reed, I understand you're having an emotional reaction, but contracts are contracts. If you attempt to interfere with our agreement with Ms. Flores, she will be in default. The full balance of the advance plus penalties becomes due immediately. That's $250,000. Can she pay that? Can you ethically take on that debt for her? It was a masterful counter-threat. It shifted the burden back onto him and framed any intervention as a catastrophic risk for Maria. Thomas saw the trap. If he paid off the agency directly, he'd be confirming their predatory system and potentially violating labor laws in ways that could get Maria deported. If he did nothing, Mateo would lose his chance. He left the office, the taste of defeat sour in his mouth. He walked in thinking his money and will could bulldoze the problem. He walked out realizing the problem was built with legal reinforced concrete. He returned home, the weight of it crushing. He found Maria in the playroom, helping Lily build a block tower. Lily laughed, a pure, bright sound. Maria smiled, a real, unguarded smile he realized he'd never seen before. It was a glimpse of the person she was beneath the uniform and the fear. He couldn't ruin this. He couldn't let his clumsy attempt at atonement make things worse. He retreated to his study, a familiar sense of impotent frustration settling over him. He was a man who could move markets, but he couldn't navigate the simple, cruel mechanics of a domestic worker's contract. It was David Chen, his lawyer, who called with the next piece of the puzzle later that night. Thomas, I dug deeper into Prestige Domestics' model. It's worse than we thought. They're not just charging high fees, they're operating a rotating debt scheme. When one advance is paid down, they incentivize the worker to take another for a family emergency, a visa renewal, you name it. They keep them in a perpetual cycle. And get this, they have a preferred partnership with that clinic Maria's using. They get a kickback for referring patients there. Thomas felt the room tilt. The agency wasn't just exploiting Maria's labor, they were profiting from her child's illness. The cruelty was so precise, so systematic, it took his breath away. So what's the move, David? I can't just buy out the contract. That feeds the beast. There might be another way, David said slowly. The interest rates they're charging, they may violate state usury laws for consumer loans. And if they're misclassifying employees as independent contractors to avoid benefits while controlling their schedules and duties, that's a whole other set of labor violations. We don't attack the contract. We attack the legality of their entire business model. A new, clearer fury focused Thomas's mind. This was no longer a personal mission to fix one wrong. It was a campaign. What do you need? A plaintiff, David said. Someone willing to stand up. It would be risky for them. Retaliation, blacklisting, immigration headaches if their status is tied to the agency. Thomas knew immediately who that plaintiff would have to be, and he knew the immense risk he'd be asking her to take. He ended the call and went to find Maria. She was in her small, plain room off the kitchen, the one without a window. She was folding laundry. Maria, he said from the doorway, we need to talk, and this time I need to listen. He laid out everything David had found, the usury, the kickbacks, the systemic trap. He told her about the potential legal challenge. It could void your contract. It could get you your full wages retroactively. It could free you, but it would mean going public in a way, fighting them. They will push back hard. Maria listened, her hands still on a folded towel. She asked one question. If we do this and we win, could it help the others, the other women at the agency? Thomas hadn't considered that. His goal had narrowed to saving Maria, to fixing his own complicity. Her question expanded the horizon. Yes, he said, it could dismantle the model for everyone. Maria looked down at the small, worn photograph of Mateo taped to her mirror. She touched the edge of it. Then we fight, she said, her voice quiet but solid as stone, for Mateo and for the others. In that moment, the dynamic in the penthouse shifted irrevocably. The millionaire and the maid were no longer employer and employee. They were reluctant allies, bound by a shared enemy and a child's fragile hope. Thomas began assembling a team, David on labor law, a private investigator to find other former Prestige workers, a PR consultant to control the narrative when this eventually blew up. But Elena Vance at Prestige Domestic was not idle. She had networks too. A week after Thomas's visit, Maria received a terse, formal letter from the agency. It cited a pattern of client dissatisfaction and placed her on immediate administrative leave, pending a review. She was to vacate the Reed residence temporarily and report to the agency for retraining. It was a classic silencing tactic: isolate the worker, cut them off from their support, and intimidate them into dropping any complaint. Maria showed the letter to Thomas, her hands trembling anew. This was the retaliation they'd feared, and it was happening faster than they'd planned. Thomas read the letter, his expression turning to ice. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "This is your home, you stay right here." For the first time, he was using his power as a shield, not a weapon. He called Elena Vance directly. "Your letter is received. Consider it rejected. Maria Flores remains employed at this residence. Any attempt to remove her will be considered wrongful termination and constructive dismissal. We'll see you in court." The line was drawn. The private conflict was about to erupt into the open. And Thomas Reed, the man who prized control above all else, was about to lose control of everything: his reputation, his carefully ordered life, and the last vestiges of his own self-image. The battle for one maid's dignity was beginning, and the first casualty would be his own privacy. The first shot in the war wasn't legal, it was a whisper. Within 48 hours of Thomas's defiant call, a gossip item appeared in a high society blog. It didn't name names, but the details were a thinly veiled caricature. A ruthless real estate tycoon was causing a domestic disturbance by refusing to let his unhappy maid leave, creating a hostage situation in his penthouse. The comments section filled with faux-concerned speculation. Elena Vance's network was at work, weaponizing rumor. Thomas's assistant forwarded him the link with a worried note. His first instinct was rage, followed by a cold, clarifying realization. This was how they fought, not in courtrooms first, but in the shadows of reputation. He called his PR consultant, Anya Sharma. "We don't respond to the blog," she advised. "We go bigger. We control the narrative with facts, not denials." Meanwhile, the private investigator, a gruff former detective named Leo, delivered his initial report. He tracked down 3 former Prestige domestic workers. Their stories were variations on Maria's theme: crushing debt, withheld passports, wages so low they relied on food banks. One woman, Sophia, had developed chronic back pain from constant work. The agency had fired her, leaving her with the medical debt and the remaining advance balance. She was living in a shelter. Leo slid a photograph across Thomas's desk. It showed Elena Vance leaving a luxury car dealership in a new sports car. "Paid in cash 2 weeks ago," Leo said. Meanwhile, the woman with the bad back can't afford a chiropractor. The moral outrage Thomas felt was now backed by a growing dossier of human cost. But the agency's next move was more direct and more devastating. A certified letter arrived from the clinic where Mateo was due to receive treatment. It was brief and bureaucratic. Due to administrative complications with their partner agency, Mateo Flores's application for the gene therapy trial was being indefinitely suspended. They recommended seeking alternative care. Maria read the letter in the kitchen, her body going completely still. Then, without a sound, she slid down the cabinet onto the floor, the paper fluttering from her hand. This wasn't a threat to her job, it was a death sentence for her son, delivered in sterile official language. Lily, playing nearby, saw Maria on the floor and immediately ran over, patting her arm with a small, worried hand. Thomas found them like that. He read the letter, and a fury so absolute washed over him that his vision narrowed. This was the kickback David had mentioned, made monstrously real. The agency wasn't just profiting from sickness, they were using a child's life as leverage. He didn't hesitate, he booked a private jet. That evening he told Maria, "Get your things, we're going to the clinic, right now." She looked at him hollow-eyed. They said no. "I'm not asking them," Thomas said. "I'm telling them, and I'm bringing their biggest donor with me." He was referring to himself. On the 2-hour flight, with Maria sitting in stunned silence and Lily asleep in a seat beside her. Thomas and Anya, the PR consultant, worked. They drafted a press release, not about a lawsuit but about a pledge. Thomas would announce a $5 million donation to fund pediatric immune deficiency research at the clinic. The catch: the announcement would be made live with the clinic's director, and it would highlight the story of their first beneficiary, Matteo Flores. It was a public relations ambush, using philanthropy as a battering ram. They landed and went straight to the clinic's administrative wing at 8 a.m. Thomas, with Maria slightly behind him, walked into the office of the director, Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a man in his 60s with the weary air of someone constantly balancing ethics and budgets. Thomas didn't sit. He placed the suspension letter on Finch's desk. Then he placed the draft press release for the donation next to it. "Dr. Finch," Thomas said, his voice even, "you have a choice. You can reinstate Matteo Flores to the trial immediately with a public story about this clinic's life-saving work, backed by a major investment. Or I will hold a different press conference on your front steps, detailing how your administrative partnership with Prestige Domestic Staffing allows a predatory agency to decide which children live or die based on their parents' debt. The headlines will write themselves. Which legacy would you prefer?" Dr. Finch looked from the letter to the press release, his face pale. He looked past Thomas to Maria, seeing not a file number, but a mother's despair. He closed his eyes for a moment. "The trial protocol has strict criteria," he began weakly. "Does it have a criteria that says you can be blackmailed by a staffing agency?" Thomas countered. "Reinstate the boy, today." Within an hour, paperwork was signed. Matteo was reinstated, with a start date in 1 week. The donation was real. Thomas wired a $2 million good faith installment on the spot. As they left the clinic, Maria stopped on the steps, the morning sun hitting her face. She started to cry, deep, shaking sobs of relief. Lily, holding her hand, looked up and hugged her leg. But back in the city, the victory was a trigger for total war. Elena Vance was livid. The clinic had folded and her leverage was gone. She escalated. Prestige Domestic filed a bombshell lawsuit, not against Maria, but against Thomas Reed. The claims were explosive: tortious interference with contract, defamation, and wrongful appropriation of services. They sought damages of $10 million. The lawsuit was deliberately designed to be salacious, filled with insinuations about Thomas's unhealthy attachment to his domestic employee. The news hit the business world like a shockwave. Thomas's upcoming investor call for the $20 million partnership cancelled. The potential partners, a conservative firm, sent a terse email citing reputational risk. Thomas's phone began ringing with concerned board members from his other companies. His net worth, tied to confidence and deals, began to tremor. David Chen was grim. "They're throwing the kitchen sink. This will be a brutal public discovery process. They will subpoena everything, your emails, your financials, Maria's entire history. They'll try to paint you as unstable and her as a manipulative gold digger." Thomas stood in his now quiet study, the city lights twinkling below. "Let them," he said. "We have the truth, and we have the other women. It's time to turn this from a defense into an offense." He authorized David to file a counterclaim on behalf of Maria and the other former workers Leo had found. It was a class-action lawsuit alleging illegal debt peonage, usury, wage theft, and fraudulent business practices. The goal was to dismantle Prestige Domestic's entire operation. The legal battle was now a very public, very messy duel. The press, smelling blood, pounced. Thomas Reed, the enigmatic millionaire, was suddenly front-page news. Camera crews staked out his building. He was forced to give a statement. Standing on the steps of his office with Maria at his side, a calculated move by Anya, he spoke without notes. "This isn't about a lawsuit. It's about a choice. We can accept systems that exploit the most vulnerable for convenience and profit, or we can choose to see the people in our homes as human beings deserving of dignity. I made the wrong choice for too long. My daughter showed me a better way. Now we're going to fight for it." The image was powerful, the billionaire and the maid united, but the backlash was immediate. Old friends in his social circle called him a traitor to his class. Talk radio hosts mocked his woke hypocrisy. A particularly vicious segment dug up his humble beginnings and accused him of class self-loathing. The pressure was immense, but it forged an unexpected solidarity in the penthouse. Maria no longer jumped at every sound. She started eating meals with Thomas and Lily, a quiet revolution in the household hierarchy. She began helping Thomas with the case, her first-hand knowledge of the agency's tactics proving invaluable. One evening, over a simple dinner she had cooked, she said to Thomas, "You are losing so much for this." Thomas looked at Lily, who was carefully feeding peas to her stuffed rabbit. "No," he said, "I'm finally gaining something." The discovery process for the lawsuits began, and it was a river of mud. Prestige's lawyers demanded every text, every email Thomas had ever sent to Maria. They demanded to depose Lily's nanny, the chef, the doorman, anyone who could paint a picture of impropriety. They were searching for any scrap to undermine his credibility. Then they found their weapon. It wasn't about Maria, it was about Thomas's past. In a deposition, a former business associate, a man Thomas had outmaneuvered in a deal years ago, was called by Prestige's lawyers. Under oath, he suggested that Thomas had a pattern of obsessive behavior and a temper that crossed lines. He mentioned an incident from a decade prior, a shoving match in a parking garage after a disputed golf bet. It was ancient, petty, and completely irrelevant to the case, but it was a seed of doubt. The next day's headline in a tabloid read, "Billionaire Bully, the Violent Past of St. Thomas Reed." The story was picked up by cable news. The narrative was subtly shifting from billionaire fights for Maid to unstable tycoon in chaotic legal battle. Thomas felt the ground crumbling beneath him. His reputation, his source of power, was being systematically destroyed. David Chen warned him that the class action was strong, but a jury trial was a gamble. Prestige's strategy was clear: make Thomas so toxic that no one would believe him and bankrupt him with legal costs in the process. The darkest moment came 2 weeks later. Thomas received a call from his largest lender. They were reviewing his credit facilities due to the ongoing litigation and reputational damage. It was a polite way of saying they might call in his loans. If that happened, his entire financial empire, built on leverage and confidence, could collapse like a house of cards. He sat in the dark in his study that night, staring at a spreadsheet that showed the cascading consequences of default. He could lose everything: the penthouse, the companies, his ability to fund Matteo's treatment, his capacity to fight. The weight of it was paralyzing. He had started this to do one right thing, and it was going to annihilate him. Maria found him there. She didn't speak. She simply poured 2 glasses of water and set one beside him. Then she said, "When Matteo was first diagnosed, I thought the fear would kill me before the disease killed him. But you learn to breathe underneath the weight. You don't have to carry it standing up. You can crawl, but you keep moving." Her words broke through his paralysis. He had been trying to fight this battle as Thomas Reed, billionaire, using money and influence as his weapons. That version of him was failing. He looked at her. "What if I can't win this as the man I am?" Maria met his gaze. "Then maybe you win it as the man you are becoming." The next morning, Thomas made a decision that shocked his legal team. He called Anya and David. "We're dropping the defamation countersuit against Prestige. We're not fighting the personal smears anymore." David protested, "Thomas, they are destroying your name." "Let them," Thomas said, a strange calm in his voice. "My name isn't the point. The point is their business model. We focus everything on the class action. We depose every victim Leo can find. We subpoena the agency's bank records. We go for the heart of the machine, not the noise it's making." It was a strategic retreat from the battle of reputation to win the war of justice. He was sacrificing his own ego to protect the case. He then did something even more radical. He went to see Sophia, the former worker living in the shelter. He didn't bring cameras. He brought an offer. He would pay for her back treatment and a small apartment, not as charity, but as advance compensation for her courage in being the lead plaintiff in the class action. He needed her story, and he would not let her suffer for it. As Thomas's public image was being dragged through the mud, a quieter, more powerful story was being assembled in file boxes and sworn testimonies. The case was no longer about a billionaire's redemption. It was about a system of exploitation, with faces and names and broken backs, and it was heading for a courtroom showdown that would change everything. The courtroom was nothing like Thomas Reed's world of marble and views. It was wood-paneled, fluorescent-lit, and smelled of old paper and anxiety. On one side sat Thomas, Maria, and their legal team. On the other, Elena Vance and her battalion of lawyers, their expressions polished and impenetrable. This was not the trial for the salacious $10 million suit that had been pushed back. This was the hearing for the class action certification. The battle to prove Prestige Domestics' model was inherently exploitative. If they won this, the house of cards would fall. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for cutting through theatrics, listened as David Chen laid out their case. He didn't start with numbers. He started with people. He called Sophia to the stand. Dressed in simple, clean clothes Thomas had provided, she walked slowly, her back pain evident. She described answering an ad for a live-in companion. She described the advance for a promised visa lawyer that never materialized. She described the deductions, the isolation, the final dismissal when her body gave out, leaving her with nothing. Elena Vance's lawyer cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Sophia as lazy, unreliable. "Isn't it true you couldn't keep up with the physical demands?" he asked. Sophia looked at him, then at the judge. The demand was to work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for pay that wouldn't feed a cat. "My body didn't give out, sir. My hope did." The gallery, filled with reporters and a few curious law students, was silent. David then presented the financial evidence. The spreadsheets showed the cash flow, from clients like Thomas into Prestige's accounts, and the tiny trickle that reached the workers. He presented the contract addendums with the usurious interest rates buried in clauses 13 and 14. An expert witness, an economist, took the stand and calmly eviscerated the model. "This isn't employment. It's a debt-financed lease on a human being." Then it was Maria's turn. She was sworn in, her voice soft but clear. David guided her through her story, Matteo's diagnosis, the desperate search for hope, the agency's solution, the years of silent servitude. He saved the clinic letter for last. He entered it into evidence. "Can you read the relevant sentence for the court, Ms. Flores?" Maria's hands shook, but she read. "Due to administrative complications with our partner agency, Matteo Flores's application is indefinitely suspended." She looked at Elena Vance. "They used my son's life to punish me for asking for dignity." Elena's lawyer objected, claiming relevance. The judge overruled. "It speaks to coercion, counsel, proceed." On cross-examination, the lawyer tried a different tack. He attempted to paint Thomas as her savior, implying her testimony was bought and paid for. "Isn't it true, Ms. Flores, that Mr. Reed is paying for your son's treatment, that he's set you up in his home, that your loyalty has been generously compensated?" Maria didn't flinch. "Mr. Reed is trying to fix a wrong he was part of, but my loyalty," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is to the truth. The truth is your client built a business on the suffering of people like me. You sell our desperation, and you bill it as a service." The hearing lasted 3 days. On the final day, David called one last witness, the private investigator, Leo. He presented photographs and documents showing Elena Vance's lavish lifestyle, funded by agency profits. He showed the kickback agreement with the clinic, obtained through a subpoena. The connection was laid bare: human suffering converted to profit, financing luxury cars. Elena Vance took the stand in her own defense. She was cool, corporate, framing everything as a voluntary agreement between consenting adults. "We provide opportunity where there was none," she insisted, but under David's cross-examination, the facade cracked. He pressed her on the effective hourly wage of Maria Flores after all deductions. "It's a salary, not an hourly wage," Elena insisted. "Fine, divide her net annual pay by the hours worked. What is the number?" Elena hesitated, calculated silently. "Approximately $3.20. The murmur in the courtroom was audible. In a city where the minimum wage was over $15. "And the interest rate on the advance?" David asked. "It's a service fee, not interest." "What is the annual percentage rate, Ms. Vance? Your own accounting shows it." Cornered, she muttered, 28%. David turned to the judge. No further questions. The judge didn't rule from the bench. She took a week to deliberate. That week was an eternity. Thomas's financial world continued to tremble. 2 more deals fell through. The bank formally placed his largest credit line under review. He spent his days in the penthouse, playing with Lily, avoiding the news. The man who had defined himself by his net worth was learning to define himself by other metrics. A child's laugh, a shared meal, the weight of doing what was right even as the ground fell away. Maria prepared to travel for Matteo's treatment, which was now just days away. Her bags were packed by the door. The air was thick with unspoken fear, fear of the verdict, fear for Matteo, fear of what came after. The call came to David Chen's office. The judge had ruled. They assembled in the courtroom one last time. The judge's words were methodical, precise. She reviewed the evidence, the financial records, the testimonies, the contracts. Then she reached her conclusion. The plaintiff has presented compelling evidence of a unified, systemic practice of exploitation, she said. The model employed by prestige domestic staffing, built on coercive debt instruments, usurious fees, and intentional wage suppression, creates a condition indistinguishable from peonage. The motion for class action certification is hereby granted. It was a dry legal victory, but its impact was seismic. The class was certified. Every current and former worker of Prestige Domestic from the last 6 years was now part of the suit. The agency faced potential damages in the tens of millions. More importantly, the judge's language was a public evisceration of their business model. News outlets that had been mocking Thomas now ran headlines like "Justice for the Invisible" and "Domestic Worker Debt Trap Exposed." Elena Vance left the courtroom pale, surrounded by lawyers whispering urgently. The civil trial for damages would be next, but the war was effectively over. The agency's reputation was shattered. Within a week, their website went dark. The phone lines were disconnected. Clients fled. The corporate entity began the slow process of dissolution. The personal lawsuit against Thomas for $10 million. Prestige's lawyers, now representing a sinking ship, quietly offered to drop it with prejudice in exchange for him not pursuing personal legal fees against Elena Vance. Thomas agreed. The noisy, personal battle vanished, leaving only the powerful, collective victory of the class action. The financial fallout for Thomas was real, but not catastrophic. He lost the $20 million partnership and 2 others. His net worth dropped by about 15%, a staggering sum to most, a manageable correction for him. The bank, seeing the resolution of the major litigation and a return to stable, if slightly diminished, operations, decided not to call in his loans. He was still wealthy beyond imagination, but he was no longer the untouchable titan. He was something else, a man who had been humbled and had chosen to stay that way. The day after the ruling, Maria left for the clinic with Matteo. Thomas and Lily drove them to the airport. At the departure curb, there were no grand speeches. Maria hugged Lily tightly, then she turned to Thomas. "Thank you," she said, simple and profound. "No," Thomas said, "thank you for not leaving when I gave you every reason to." He handed her an envelope. "This isn't from me, it's from the Advanced Settlement Fund David set up. It's your first disbursement, for Matteo and for you." Maria took it, her eyes bright. She boarded the plane. The treatment was long, arduous, and fraught with risk. For months, updates came via text and brief calls. There were setbacks, fevers, terrifying nights, but there was also progress. Slowly, steadily, Matteo's immune system began to show signs of accepting the new genetic code. He was responding. During those months, the penthouse changed. Thomas hired a new housekeeping service, one he vetted personally, that paid a living wage and benefits. He turned one of his guest rooms into a proper, sunlit bedroom for Maria for when she returned. He spent less time in his study and more time on the floor of the playroom. He learned how to make a peanut butter sandwich. He learned how to listen. 6 months after the hearing, Maria returned. Matteo, while not fully cured, was out of immediate danger and continuing treatment as an outpatient. He was a shy, bright-eyed boy who clung to his mother's hand. The reunion in the penthouse foyer was quiet. Lily, now 5, presented Matteo with her favorite stuffed rabbit. Matteo, after a moment of hesitation, offered her a small, polished stone he'd carried from home. Thomas watched the children, then looked at Maria. She was different. The constant fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary but steady resilience. She was no longer an employee, she was family. One evening, Thomas asked her about her plans. With the debt gone and a substantial settlement from the class action on its way, she could do anything. Maria thought for a moment. "I want to start a small cooperative," she said, "a cleaning service owned by the women who do the work. No agencies, no debt, fair pay, fair hours. We could train others coming out of situations like mine." She looked at him. "I would need a business advisor." Thomas smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I know a guy," he said. The final surprising detail emerged quietly a year later. Thomas was invited to speak at a prestigious business ethics forum, the kind of event he would have once mocked. He brought Maria with him. During the Q&A, a young entrepreneur asked him, "What was the single hardest moment in the whole ordeal, the point where you almost quit?" Thomas didn't talk about the lawsuit or the financial threats. He said, "It was the moment I realized my daughter saw me as the villain in someone else's story, that she had to get on the floor to show me what basic humanity looked like. That was the fracture. Everything else was just the noise of the breaking." After the forum, an older woman approached Maria. She was elegantly dressed, with a kind face. She introduced herself as the chairwoman of a large philanthropic foundation. "Your story and your plan for the cooperative is extraordinary," she said. "We would be honored to offer a seed grant to help you launch. Not a loan, a grant." It was the final validation, not from the world of money and deals, but from the world of conscience and change. Maria's cooperative, Solidarity Home Care, opened its doors 6 months later. Its first hires were Sophia and 2 other women from the prestige domestic lawsuit. Thomas Reed still lives in the penthouse. He still makes deals, but the trophy on his desk is no longer a crystal obelisk from a closed transaction. It's a small, clumsy clay bowl made by Lily in preschool. It sits next to a framed photo of 4 people, Thomas, Lily, Maria, and Matteo, all smiling on a picnic in the park. The billionaire, the maid, and the 2 children who taught them both how to be human. The story that began with a thrown lunch ended not with an apology, but with a revolution. A quiet, personal revolution that rippled outwards, changing laws, changing lives, and proving that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or control. It's the simple, stubborn act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and choosing, against all logic and convention, to sit on the floor beside them. So what do we take from a story like this? It's easy to see it as a singular tale of redemption, a wealthy man who found his conscience, but that misses the point entirely. The true engine of this story was Thomas Reed's guilt. It was his daughter's unwavering moral clarity. Before any lawsuit, before any grand gesture, there was a simple, silent act of solidarity from a child who saw wrong and, without a second thought, moved to make it right. That moment on the kitchen floor exposes a profound truth about power and perception. We build intricate systems, legal, financial, social, to justify hierarchy and distance. We create narratives about merit, about contracts, about the way things have to be. And then a 4-year-old cuts through it all with a gesture so pure it renders the entire complex structure absurd. She didn't see a maid. She didn't see an employee. She saw a person who was hurt, and she went to sit beside her. In that action lies a challenge to every one of us. How many times have we been Thomas Reed, not necessarily a millionaire, but someone benefiting from an unseen imbalance? How often do we accept the convenient arrangements of our lives without questioning the hidden costs paid by someone else? The quiet exploitation in supply chains, the disregarded labor that maintains our comfort, the polite indifference to suffering that doesn't touch our doorstep. We are all, in some way, complicit in systems we did not create, but from which we gain. And how many times have we been Maria, carrying a private burden, masking fear with silence, believing that our dignity is a negotiable commodity for survival? The story reminds us that the people we render invisible are whole universes of struggle, love, and resilience. Their quietness is not consent, it is often the armor of the powerless. This is not a fable about a villain and a hero. It is a blueprint for moral courage. Change did not begin when Thomas wrote a check. It began when he allowed his daughter's act to fracture his worldview. It began when he chose to listen to a story he had the power to ignore. Real change always starts with a willingness to be uncomfortable, to have your certainties dismantled by a truth you've been taught not to see. The legacy of that throne lunch isn't a cleaned-up corporation or a settled lawsuit. The legacy is a question that now hangs in the air of every comfortable home, every sleek office, every space where hierarchy is assumed. The question is this: who in your world is sitting alone on the floor, and what would it cost you to go and sit beside them? It might cost you pride, it might cost you convenience, it might, as it did for Thomas, cost you a portion of your fortune and your old identity, but it will gain you something money cannot measure: your own humanity, returned to you by the very people you overlooked. We live in a world that often feels too big, too broken, too complex to fix. This story tells us otherwise. It tells us that the most radical revolutions begin in the smallest, most intimate spaces. In a kitchen, in a glance, in a shared sandwich. The call is not to overthrow empires, but to see the person right in front of you. To choose empathy over efficiency, solidarity over status, and love over the cold logic of the ledger. Now we turn that question to you. Look around your own life. Think of a moment where you witnessed a small injustice, a quiet humiliation. Did you speak? Did you act? Or did you, like so many of us, look away and tell yourself it wasn't your place? Your story matters, your choice matters. Share it with us in the comments below. Let's build a conversation about the everyday courage that changes worlds. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell tales of dramatic transformation. We examine the quiet, powerful moments where humanity breaks through, reminding us all that it's never too late to choose a better path. It's never too late to sit on the floor.